It's like watching a bank robber get convicted and then handed the vault keys on the way out. Let me ask you something. What would you call a system where the same signature that punishes a crime can also erase it, selectively, strategically, and almost immediately after $1 million dinner? This is not a normal presidency. This is not a routine use of executive power. This is a stress test of the Constitution itself, where the line between justice and loyalty is no longer just blurred. It's being actively redrawn. At the center of it is Donald Trump, and in the early months of his second term, the pattern is not subtle, it's accelerating. We are talking about pardons issued not quietly, not sparingly, but rapidly, publicly, and with a very specific direction, toward allies, loyalists, and individuals connected to him politically or personally. One case stands out. According to reporting, a Florida businessman convicted of tax evasion had his sentence erased just 3 weeks after his mother attended a $1 million per-plate fundraising dinner tied to Trump's political network. Prison time, gone. Millions in restitution, wiped. And that's not an isolated incident, that's a pattern. So the real question isn't whether the pardon power exists. The real question is, what happens when it stops being about justice and starts operating like a transaction? Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. 77 names granted full, complete, unconditional pardons, many tied directly to efforts surrounding the aftermath of the 2020 United States presidential election, not minor infractions, not isolated cases. This is a coordinated sweep. Among them, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, and Mark Meadows, individuals who didn't just orbit power, they actively operated within it. And here's where this stops being political narrative and starts looking like a prosecutorial record. In 2018, Donald Trump said it out loud. He claimed he had the absolute right to pardon himself. That's not speculation. That's not interpretation. That is a direct statement, on record. Now pause there. Because that sentence does two things at once. It asserts power and it introduces intent. Under basic legal reasoning, people who believe they've done nothing wrong don't publicly outline escape routes. They don't test the limits of immunity in advance. That's not how innocence talks. That's how risk management talks. Now stack the evidence. A fundraising dinner with $1 million tickets, followed by a pardon within 3 weeks. Dozens of political allies facing legal exposure, suddenly receiving full immunity. Nearly $2 billion in restitution and fines, money legally owed to victims, erased through executive action. And what's missing? No detailed justification for the victims, no explanation of why these cases met any traditional standard of mercy, no transparency in process, the formal review system bypassed. So ask yourself, if the process is ignored, the beneficiaries are consistent, and the outcomes align with personal loyalty, at what point does this stop looking like constitutional authority and start looking like a closed loop of protection? Now shift the lens, because this is where the legal architecture itself starts to crack under pressure. The pardon power, as written in the Constitution, was never designed to function like this. It was meant to correct miscarriages of justice, to offer mercy where the system had been too rigid, too slow, too unforgiving. It was not designed to reward loyalty, erase financial accountability, or quietly neutralize legal exposure for those operating inside a political orbit. Yet what we're seeing is a complete inversion of that purpose. Let's go into prosecutorial mode. There is a foundational principle in Anglo-American law. No one can be the judge in their own case. It predates the Constitution. It predates modern courts. It is the backbone of what we call fairness. And yet, when Donald Trump publicly claimed he had the absolute right to pardon himself, he wasn't just making a bold statement, he was directly colliding with that principle. Now stack that against behavior. Pardons issued to political allies, financial penalties erased, legal consequences dissolved, a pattern where the beneficiaries are not random citizens seeking mercy, but individuals with proximity to power. That's not incidental, that's directional. And here's the contradiction that matters. Trump simultaneously claims two things. One, that he has the absolute authority to pardon himself, and two, that he would never need to use it because he has done nothing wrong. Those two claims cannot comfortably coexist, because asserting a power you insist you'll never need still reveals something. It reveals that you've considered the scenario where you might. That's not theory, that's mindset. Now bring in the numbers, because numbers don't argue, they accumulate. Nearly $2 billion in restitution and fines, money ordered by courts to be paid to victims of financial crimes, effectively wiped out. Think about what that actually means in real terms. That's not abstract budget math. That's families defrauded, businesses drained, individuals who went through the entire legal process, who waited, who won in court, and then watched the outcome disappear with a single executive action. No hearing, no appeal, no recourse. And what was said about them? Almost nothing. This is where the silence becomes louder than the statements. Because every time a pardon is announced without addressing the victims, the message is implicit. Their losses are secondary. Their justice is optional. Now extend that logic forward. If the pardon power can be used to shield allies, if it can erase billions in financial accountability, if it can bypass institutional review, then the question of self-pardon is no longer abstract. It becomes the final step in a pattern that is already visible. Because systems don't break all at once, they bend first, they stretch, they normalize exceptions, and then one day the exception becomes the rule. So when a president openly discusses the ability to pardon himself while actively using that same power to protect those around him, the issue isn't hypothetical anymore. It's cumulative. And it's pointing in one direction, toward a version of executive power where accountability is no longer guaranteed, it's negotiable. And this is the moment where the story stops being about one president and starts being about the system itself. Because if the law can be bent for allies, if consequences can be erased for those close to power, then what remains for everyone else? What remains for the people who followed the rules, trusted the courts, waited for justice to work the way it was promised to work? Picture it clearly. A victim sits through years of legal proceedings, evidence presented, verdict delivered, restitution ordered, a number assigned to represent loss, damage, harm, and then, without warning, without explanation that addresses them, that number becomes zero, not reduced, not negotiated, erased. That is not an abstract constitutional debate, that is a real-world consequence. And now place that next to a president who once said he could pardon himself, not quietly, not in a legal memo buried somewhere, publicly, directly, on record. That statement doesn't exist in isolation anymore. It sits on top of a pattern, reinforced by actions, not just words. This is the moral contrast that matters. On one side, concentrated power, exercised with precision for those inside the circle. On the other, ordinary people whose outcomes can be undone with a signature they will never see coming. So ask yourself, if the same hand that can erase someone else's sentence can also erase its own, then where exactly does accountability live? Is it in the courts, in Congress, or does it simply depend on whether power chooses to limit itself? Because that's what this comes down to. Not party, not personality, not headlines. Whether the rule of law is a fixed boundary or a flexible tool. If you think this matters, if you think the answer to that question defines more than just one presidency, then make your voice part of the record. Like the video, share it, subscribe, and most importantly, comment. Because silence in moments like this isn't neutral. It's permission.